a wisp of a woman, standing barely 5'4", her presence almost ghostly in its frailty. Yet, there was an undeniable strength in her stance, a resilience that belied her slight frame. A cigarette often dangled from her lips, a small rebellion against the world that had shown her little kindness. The smoke curled around her like a shroud, a veil that both concealed and revealed the depths of her inner turmoil. But behind Aileen Wuornos' hardened gaze lived a storm of rage, a fury that had been kindled by years of betrayal and neglect. Her eyes, windows to a soul battered by life's relentless cruelty, held a fire that refused to be extinguished, a tempest fueled by a life of brutal hardship and unspeakable abuse. From a young age, Aileen was thrust into a world of violence and exploitation, her innocence shattered by those who should have protected her. Each bruise, each scar told a story of survival in a world that seemed determined to break her. Hers is a story of survival, of the dark side of the American dream curdling into a nightmare. A tale that begins in the shadows of society, where the forgotten and the forsaken dwell. Aileen's journey is a stark reminder of the thin line between hope and despair, between the promise of a better life and the harsh reality of a broken system. It's a story that chills the blood, even as it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the shadows that lurk at the edges of our society. Aileen Wuornos' life compels us to look beyond the headlines, to see the human being behind the label of monster. It challenges us to question the societal structures that can create such profound suffering and to reflect on our own roles within these systems. As we delve into her story, we are reminded that every life, no matter how troubled, has a narrative worth understanding. This is not just a tale of crime and punishment, but a poignant exploration of the human condition, of the ways in which we are all shaped by our experiences and the world around us. So, as we embark on this journey through the life of Aileen Wuornos, let us do so with empathy and an open mind. Let us seek to understand the complexities of her existence, the pain that drove her, and the moments of humanity that persisted despite it all. For in understanding her story, we may find a deeper understanding of ourselves and the society we inhabit. Aileen's early years read like a gothic horror story. Born into a world that seemed to conspire against her from the very beginning, her life was marked by a series of tragic and harrowing events that would shape her into the person she would become. Abandoned by her mother, shuffled between relatives and foster homes, Aileen's childhood was a revolving door of instability and neglect. Each new home brought with it a fresh set of challenges and traumas, leaving her feeling more isolated and unloved with each passing day. She was just a child when the abuse began. The very people who were supposed to protect and care for her became the sources of her deepest fears. The physical and emotional scars they left behind would haunt her for the rest of her life. Sexual violation, beatings. These were the twisted lessons she was forced to learn. The abuse was relentless, stripping away her innocence and leaving her with a profound sense of worthlessness. She learned to expect pain and betrayal from those around her. Is it any wonder that the seeds of rage took root in such poisoned soil? The anger and resentment that festered within her were the natural byproducts of a life filled with cruelty and neglect. She was a child, but her heart was already hardened by the harsh realities she faced. By the time she was a teenager, Aileen had already known more pain and fear than most people experience in a lifetime. Her teenage years were a continuation of the nightmare that had been her childhood. She struggled to find her place in a world that had shown her nothing but hostility. The streets became her home, and survival became her only goal. She was a lost soul, wandering through life with a heavy heart and a troubled mind. The darkness of her past cast a long shadow over her future, making it difficult for her to see any light at the end of the tunnel. She sought solace on the streets, her body becoming a commodity, her vulnerability preyed upon by the very people who should have offered her protection. Life on the road was a brutal education. Aileen drifted from town to town, picking up odd jobs, her existence a precarious balancing act on the knife edge of survival. Men, she learned, were sources of both fleeting comfort and terrifying violence. It was in this dangerous world, where desperation clung to every street corner, that Aileen met Tyria Moore, a woman who offered her a glimmer of hope, a promise of love in the desolate landscape of her life. But love, even when genuine, couldn't erase the scars of Aileen's past, couldn't silence the demons that whispered in her ear. Then came the murders. 7 men, all shot dead, their lives extinguished in a blaze of violence. Aileen claimed self-defense, her voice cracking as she described being raped, brutalized by these men who picked her up on the highway. The courtroom became a stage for a chilling drama. The petite woman in chains transformed into a monstrous figure, a predator who preyed on unsuspecting victims. The prosecution painted a different picture. Aileen wasn't a victim, they argued, but a cold-blooded killer, driven by greed, her pockets filled with the meager possessions of her victims. The jury listened, their faces impassive, as the details of each murder were laid bare, the horror of Aileen's actions seeping into the very walls of the courtroom. The guilty verdict was a foregone conclusion. Aileen Wuornos, the woman who had endured a lifetime of abuse, who had survived by her wits and her rage, was sentenced to death. She became a macabre celebrity, her story splashed across newspapers and television screens, her face the stuff of nightmares. But was Aileen a monster? Or was she a victim, driven to the brink by a lifetime of trauma? The truth, as always, is far more complicated. Aileen Wuornos was a product of the society that failed her, a society that turns a blind eye to abuse, that demonizes the vulnerable, that offers few exits from the cycle of poverty and violence. Aileen's mental state became a focal point of the case. She was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, her mind a battleground of conflicting emotions, her grip on reality tenuous at best. Experts testified about the impact of her traumatic childhood, the years of abuse leaving her psyche fractured, her ability to control her impulses severely impaired. But even as the evidence of her mental illness mounted, the legal system seemed ill-equipped to grapple with its complexities. Aileen's claims of self-defense rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence against her. She was portrayed as a manipulator, a cunning predator who used her sexuality as a weapon. The jury, it seemed, couldn't reconcile the image of the abused child with the cold-blooded killer who stared back at them from the defendant's table. In the end, Aileen Wuornos' story is a tragedy on multiple levels. Her life, from beginning to end, is a haunting reminder of the many ways in which society can fail an individual. Born into a world of chaos and neglect, Aileen's early years were marked by instability and abuse. Her father was a convicted child molester who committed suicide in prison, and her mother abandoned her and her brother when Aileen was just a toddler. Raised by her grandparents, she faced further abuse and neglect, setting the stage for a life of turmoil and desperation. It's a tragedy for the victims and their families, their lives cut short by senseless violence. Each victim had their own story, their own dreams and aspirations, all brutally ended by Aileen's actions. The pain and suffering inflicted on their loved ones is immeasurable, a wound that never fully heals. The ripple effects of such violence extend far beyond the immediate loss, affecting entire communities and leaving a lasting scar on the collective consciousness. It's a tragedy for a society that failed to protect a vulnerable child, that allowed her to fall through the cracks, her cries for help lost in the deafening silence. Aileen's early life was a series of missed opportunities for intervention. From the abuse she suffered at home to the exploitation she faced on the streets, there were countless moments where a helping hand could have made a difference. Instead, she was met with indifference and neglect, her pain ignored by those who could have offered support. And it's a tragedy for Aileen herself, a woman whose life was defined by the abuse she suffered and the violence she inflicted. Her descent into a life of crime was not a sudden fall, but a gradual slide into darkness, fueled by years of trauma and desperation. Her actions were undeniably horrific, but they were also the result of a lifetime of suffering and a desperate struggle for survival. In the courtroom, she was portrayed as a monster, but behind the headlines was a deeply troubled individual, shaped by a lifetime of pain. A woman who died alone, strapped to a gurney, her last breath a testament to the brutal realities of her existence. Her execution was the final chapter in a life filled with suffering, a stark reminder of the failures of the systems meant to protect and rehabilitate. In her final moments, Aileen Wuornos remained a figure of controversy and tragedy. Her story a complex tapestry of victimhood and violence. Her life and death continue to provoke reflection on the nature of justice, the impact of trauma, and the ways in which society can better support its most vulnerable members. Aileen Wuornos' case ignited a firestorm of debate about the death penalty, about the treatment of women in the criminal justice system, about the very nature of evil. Was she a victim or a villain? A monster or a martyr? The answers are rarely simple, and in Aileen's case, they remain elusive, even decades after her execution. Her story is a stark reminder of the human capacity for both good and evil, of the fine line that separates victim from perpetrator, and of the enduring power of our darkest impulse.